The Battle of Iwo Jima was one of the bloodiest fights of World War II. In early 1945, American forces landed on a small volcanic island about 750 miles from Japan. Waiting for them were around 21,000 Japanese soldiers. By the end of the battle, almost all of them were dead. Fewer than 300 were taken prisoner. That means nearly 99% of the Japanese troops on Iwo Jima never left the island alive. For the United States, it was a costly win, with tens of thousands of casualties. But for Japan, it was almost total destruction. So why did so few survive? Was it the island's terrain, strict military orders, or a culture that rejected surrender? By early 1945, Japan was losing the war. The Allies had taken back much of the Pacific, and American bombers were flying regular raids on Japan itself. Iwo Jima, a small island halfway between Japan and the Mariana Islands, became critically important. For the United States, controlling it meant two things. First, American fighters could escort bombers on missions to Japan, and second, damaged planes returning from raids would have a safe place to land. For Japan, holding Iwo Jima was about buying time and slowing the American advance. The man in charge of defending the island was General Tadamichi Kuribayashi. Unlike earlier Japanese commanders who favored massive banzai charges, Kuribayashi planned a defensive battle. He ordered his men to dig deep tunnels, set up hidden bunkers, and use the island's terrain to bleed the Americans. But one thing never changed. Surrender was not an option. The Japanese high command and military culture demanded that soldiers fight until death. In this sense, Iwo Jima was not just a fight for land, it was also a clash of strategies, with Japan determined to make the US pay dearly for every inch. The numbers from Iwo Jima tell the story better than anything else. When the battle began, around 21,000 Japanese soldiers were stationed on the island. By the time it ended, only about 216 were captured alive, with a few dozen more surrendering later from hiding. That's where the figure of 99% comes from. Almost every Japanese defender was killed. On the American side, victory also came at a terrible cost. Nearly 7,000 US Marines were killed and more than 20,000 were wounded. In fact, Iwo Jima was one of the few battles in the Pacific where American casualties outnumbered Japanese survivors. The island itself was only 8 square miles, yet it became one of the bloodiest pieces of ground in the entire war. The sheer scale of loss on both sides is what made Iwo Jima such a defining and haunting battle. Iwo Jima was not just another island, it was a fortress. Made of volcanic rock, the ground was hard to dig into but perfect for building defenses. General Kuribayashi ordered miles of tunnels to be carved under the island, connecting bunkers, artillery positions, and hidden firing points. This underground network meant Japanese troops could disappear, reappear somewhere else, and keep fighting even after heavy bombardment. For the Americans, this made the battle extremely difficult. Before the landing, the US Navy and Air Force pounded Iwo Jima with bombs and shells for weeks. But when the Marines came ashore on February 19, 1945, they discovered most of the enemy was still alive, waiting underground. The black volcanic sand slowed the Americans down, offering no cover. Machine guns, mortars, and artillery rained down from hidden positions. Every inch of the island was covered by overlapping fields of fire. In short, the geography and defenses of Iwo Jima made escape almost impossible for the Japanese and survival very unlikely. They were trapped in their own fortress, with no way out once the Americans closed in. The Japanese defense of Iwo Jima was different from earlier battles in the Pacific. In places like Guadalcanal or Saipan, Japanese commanders often ordered large, desperate banzai charges. These human wave attacks caused casualties, but usually ended in disaster for the attackers. General Kuribayashi knew better. He banned such attacks at the start of Iwo Jima. Instead, he told his men to stay hidden, fight from cover, and make every bullet count. This strategy shocked the Marines. Instead of facing reckless charges, they were being cut down by snipers, machine guns, and artillery from hidden positions. progress was painfully slow. Sometimes it took days to capture a single hill or bunker. When Japanese units were finally cornered, many soldiers refused to surrender. They would fight to the last round, then use grenades on themselves. Others launched small nighttime raids, sneaking behind American lines to cause chaos. In the final days of the battle, when the situation was hopeless, some groups still carried out banzai charges. But these were acts of desperation. By then, the defenders had no food, no ammunition, and no hope. The rules were simple. Don't surrender, don't expect rescue, and fight until death. Even the strongest defenses can't last without supplies, and that was one of Japan's biggest problems on Iwo Jima. Once the U.S. Navy surrounded the island, there was no chance of resupply. No food, no fresh water, no ammunition, and no reinforcements could get through. The Japanese soldiers had to survive on what little they had stored before the battle. Medical care was almost impossible. Wounded men were often left in caves with no treatment. There weren't enough doctors or medicine, and moving the injured through narrow tunnels was nearly impossible. Many simply died underground. As the weeks dragged on, Japanese soldiers faced starvation and dehydration. Ammunition ran dangerously low, leaving them with only grenades or bayonets. Some units fought hand-to-hand because they had no bullets left. By the final stages of the battle, most defenders were physically broken, but orders still demanded they keep fighting. Survival wasn't part of the plan. With no supplies and no way out, death was almost guaranteed for the garrison of Iwo Jima. Beyond strategy and supplies, the mindset of Japanese soldiers played a huge role in why almost none survived Iwo Jima. In Japanese military culture, surrender was seen as shameful. Soldiers were taught that it was better to die for the emperor than to be captured. This belief came from the samurai code of Bushido, which valued honor in death over the disgrace of surrender. Japanese propaganda made this even stronger. Troops were told that Americans would torture or kill prisoners, so surrender wasn't just dishonorable, it was terrifying. For many, suicide seemed like the only option if capture was certain. Some soldiers blew themselves up with grenades, while others waited to be killed in their bunkers rather than give up. General Korebayashi himself refused to surrender, fighting to the very end. His example, combined with years of military indoctrination, convinced his men to do the same. On Iwo Jima, death wasn't just expected, it was considered the only honorable outcome. This cultural mindset explains why, even when defeat was clear, almost none of the defenders laid down their arms. When the battle officially ended in March 1945, the island was declared secure. But in reality, not every Japanese soldier was dead. Dozens had gone into hiding inside the tunnels and caves, surviving on scraps of food and rainwater. These stragglers sometimes attacked patrols at night, or resisted when discovered. Some held out for weeks, even months. Most of these men eventually died in their hiding places, but a handful surrendered long after the battle. In fact, the last known group of survivors didn't give up until 1949, 4 years after the war was over. Their presence showed how deeply the fight-to-the-death mentality had been drilled into the defenders of Iwo Jima. The idea that 99% of Japanese soldiers died on Iwo Jima is powerful, but it's also a little misleading. The number comes from comparing the original garrison of about 21,000 to the few hundred who were captured alive. That does mean almost all were killed, but the exact percentage varies depending on which figures you use. Some sources say around 18,000 to 19,000 Japanese soldiers died, while others put it slightly higher. What matters more than the precise number is the scale. The Japanese force on Iwo Jima was almost completely destroyed. Unlike most battles where thousands are taken prisoner, here the survivors were just a fraction. Whether it was 98% or 99%, the result was the same: near total annihilation. The story of Iwo Jima is more than just numbers. It was a turning point that showed how far Japan was willing to go in defense of its homeland, and how high the cost would be for the United States. The near-total destruction of the Japanese garrison revealed the strength of a military culture that valued death over surrender. But it also highlighted the brutal reality of modern war. For the United States, Iwo Jima was both a victory and a warning. The island gave American bombers a vital base, but the price was staggering. Thousands of Marines killed and many more wounded. The ferocity of the battle influenced U.S. planning for future operations, especially the invasion of Okinawa and the eventual decision to use atomic bombs on Japan. For Japan, Iwo Jima became a symbol of sacrifice and resistance. General Kuribayashi and his men are remembered as warriors who fought to the last breath. Yet their fate also showed the futility of absolute resistance against overwhelming force. In the end, the near 99% death rate at Iwo Jima stands as one of the clearest examples of how culture, strategy, and desperation combined to make survival nearly impossible.